between services was the first talk I gave here, so I'm back where I first began. So Tonglen is a Tibetan meditation tradition. It must have been around for at least 1,000 years. It is a practice of breathing in suffering and breathing out love. And that said might be enough to make you get up and walk out. If you happen to leave at this moment, I'll know that I didn't do a great job of laying the foundation for this. So let me go back and start over. Tonglen meditation is about the heart. Now, it does involve breathing in suffering and breathing out love, but it's in service of two things. One is it's in service of compassion for another or for yourself. And this compassion for another or yourself comes when we are not afraid to bring in the suffering that is happening, and we bring it in, and it begins to break down our fear of the suffering. And one way to imagine this is that you have a heart which is, through the course of life, you have learned to protect in some way. That protection is in the form of a steel case that surrounds the heart. And when you breathe in the suffering, what it does is it comes in and it touches that steel case, and it begins to shatter the case, and it lets it into the heart. And once it's in the heart, it finds a spaciousness that allows it to be transformed in energy into another form of energy, which we call love. But the most important thing about this is that it is coming in and shattering this casing around your heart. As it shatters this casing, it also begins to have the effect of dissolving your ego as your primary form of identification. Because it is the fear and the encasement of the heart which has held us in this separate sense of self, this ego state, that has made that the predominant experience of our life. Is because the more we stay behind this encasement in our heart, the more we are convinced that we are alone and separate. And when the protection of the heart breaks down or shatters, then we begin to have a more primary experience, the experience of oneness with all that is. And compassion, this sharing with the experience of others, this sharing with becomes natural because we are now not defending against having that. So you may know that a practice like this takes some courage, right? Especially in the beginning. Because we're going against the grain of the ego at this point. We're going against our self-protection and this idea that I only want good happen to me and I will do anything I can to avoid pain and suffering. And we're going against that. And we're saying instead, I'm open. And in this openness, then the heart begins to be touched by what's happening in the world or what's happening in your life. And instead of running from it and closing it off in a steel case, we open it. And in opening it, it does something magical, is that it can take that suffering in and it converts it into love. And that's the practice of Tonglen, is the giving and receiving. Or it starts really off with the receiving and giving. So we receive the suffering, ours or anyone else's, and we send out love. Receive and give. To do this, of course, it takes courage. So I was talking with someone who speaks French between services, because I'd use the word compassion and I'd use the word courage, and both of those words come from French. Courage means of the heart. So this is building courage. And passion is, in its original meaning, was suffering. So, today we talk about passion, and it sounds like the greatest thing that can happen to you since we started slicing bread. But in the original meaning, it is the suffering. So the passion of Christ is called the suffering of Christ. So this compassion means we are with others in their suffering. We can also be with ourselves in our suffering, our compassion. And it is so much not of the screen era, if you know what I mean. It's not of like distraction and activity and all of that. This is of a depth that comes from opening your heart and settling into what is. And the beauty of this is that as you do this, tears may come, sadness may be obvious, sorrow, anger, frustration, oh yes, you may feel those. But once they're brought in close enough, they get changed into something else. And so the act of Tonglen is to receive your suffering, to receive another's suffering, and to let it be transformed. It goes like this, as practice. Just as practice, we're going to do several steps of this, and so I've kind of given you an overlay, but one of the quickest ways, one of the traditional ways at least, of learning how to do Tonglen is just to practice breathing. With the thought that as you breathe in essentially polluted air. And as you breathe out clean air. So the traditional way of saying this is the air is warm, the air is dirty, and it is dark. So you breathe in darkness, dirtiness, and you breathe out love and light and cleanliness. And of course, most of our life, we try to do just the opposite. You know, it's just the opposite. This way we're doing something unusual. So try this with me. Just breathe in the dark, smoky air in your imagination, and then breathe out light, cool, clean air. We just practice for a few minutes. You can do it with your eyes open or closed, but you're breathing in dark, smoky air, breathing out light, clean air. And when you breathe it in, just breathe it into the heart space while you're at it, just to get used to breathing into that space. You breathe into it, and you breathe out. Okay, we can bring that to a close for the moment. So we're going to practice later changing this to breathing in suffering and breathing out love. But first, this is just a method of getting yourself into the habit of breathing in that which you've been avoiding and breathing out love. Okay, so Jesus. So this is a Tibetan tradition, but there's a phrase in the Christian tradition also that Jesus is on the cross to take away the sins of the world. Right? You with me? That you've heard that phrase. Jesus died to take away the sins of the world. Now, in a certain sense, the ego is dying in this process. And it does so by taking on the suffering of the world and giving out love. It is the practice of receiving the sins, the missing parts, the parts that didn't work, receiving that which failed, and giving out love. And when I first started doing Tonglen meditations, the first time I understood this phrase is, Jesus takes on the sins of the world. How could that be? It's like, that math didn't make sense to me. But in this sense, it does. You know, you breathe in the suffering of yourself or others, and you breathe out love. And this transformation happens not because you're able to maintain a separate sense of self that I am doing this heroic act. No, it comes with the dissolution of the sense of separateness. Then you become to merge into this Christ nature which you are. And yes, essentially the ego is crucified in this process, but the Christ emerges after or during this, and you become the being that brings light into the world. And it becomes the method of dissolving the ego, and that's why it is practiced so much in Tibet, or in the Tibetan tradition. The Dalai Lama does this. Pema Chodron teaches this. Many of the Tibetans practice and teach this. This is the practice of coming into a state of not separateness, but oneness. And so it's a powerful practice. Anna was telling me that she was at a retreat, and at this retreat, the teacher, one of the teachers that was there said, if you had only one practice, if you did only one form of meditation your whole life, do this one. Right? She says yes. So think of it, it's not an inconsequential, maybe it's something you could take up. There's a phrase in our culture that says, in victory we are alone, in defeat we're all together. Now, many of us want to experience defeat, but if you think about it, in our suffering, we have a commonality with the rest of the world. The whole world suffers in the same ways that we suffer. Everyone wants to be happy, and they want to avoid suffering, and yet we have it. And so, just like the Buddha said, that the life has dissatisfaction in it. The Buddha said that, like you can't avoid it. And this is a way to get away from what is occurring to everyone, not by running from it, but by absorbing it and converting it. So if you've noticed, running from your suffering might not have worked yet. It might not. Maybe it has, temporarily. But instead, consume it, convert it, and send it out as love. Let's practice again. So we'll start with the breath. We'll start by breathing in and breathing out. We breathe in suffering. Later we'll do the breathe in suffering and breathe out love. But right now we're just breathing in smoke and breathing out clean air. Comes into the heart. Comes in dirty, goes out clean. Okay, now let's bring that to a close. Now I want to come back to the concept of the heart. So first thing you do in Tonglen meditation is activate the heart. So you bring the heart, you bring it up to speed. And that's not always purely, completely possible. You're probably going to encounter sometimes in your life where you're not able to come fully into your heart, but you do the best you can. So you bring your consciousness, your breath, everything into the heart, and you begin to expand the heart as fully as you can. You let that become the bigger part of you, not the thinking part of you, to the best of your ability in that moment. So that becomes where the consciousness is, where the breath is, where the sense of identity is now in the heart, not in the head. So we come into the heart. And once we're in the heart, then we can start the breathing practice where we're breathing in and breathing out. Breathing in suffering, breathing out love. So we do that. And all you have to do is contemplate your own suffering or the suffering of someone you know personally or the suffering of the world. It doesn't matter. And it could be any form of suffering, from hate to fear to disappointment or whatever. You breathe that suffering in, you breathe it into your heart, and then you breathe out love. And my suggestion is that you don't take in the whole world suffering in your first breath. It might be overwhelming, I'm not sure. Breathe in some suffering, breathe out some love. Breathe in some suffering, breathe out some love. So Milarepa, I think it was Milarepa, the Tibetan who brought or the person who brought Buddhism to Tibet, was on his way to heaven. And he was told at the gate that you can come into heaven, but you got to stop this Tonglen meditation. He said, well, then I'm not coming. Right? I'm not coming if I can't bring all souls with me, or I'm not sure what his deal was, but he just said, I'm not doing it. This had become so important to him, this breathing in of his suffering or everyone else's suffering and breathing out love, that he wasn't willing to go to heaven and do without it. It reminds me of the story in the Western tradition where the guy dies and he goes to heaven, but he has his dog with him, and they say, well, you can come into heaven, but your dog can't. And he says, then I'm not coming. I'm not coming. It's like, keep your heaven. I'm keeping love. I'm going to keep love. So you can do what you want with it. And this, I think, is the meaning of that story with Milarepa, the same thing. I'm going to keep my heart in love, and I'm not moving just to have my bliss. I'm going bigger than that. Right? Now, the thing that's also true here is that probably a lot of our suffering is coming because we have chosen badly in the past. And we often have chosen badly in the past because we were trying to avoid suffering in the first place. So just absorb it. Be bigger than that. And then the suffering comes into the container of the heart and is dissolved and goes into something else. The Buddha said life is suffering, but he also said there is a way out. This is a way out. Jesus said, I have overcome the world. I have overcome the world. What would that mean? Obviously, we still have wars and all that sort of stuff, but the heart can bring us back to the truth of who we are, to the depth of who we are. And that is the benefit of this meditation. So let's now practice real Tonglen. So let's start by opening the heart as best we can to the highest level we can in this moment by breathing into it, visualizing light in it, identifying with it, feeling into it, speaking to it, however you know to do it. Thinking of someone you love without conditions. The heart is powerful. Let your heart be powerful. And now, like you were sipping a hot drink, not gulping it, but drink, sipping in suffering, begin to take a breath of suffering and breathe out love. And we don't have to be perfect. Breathe in suffering, breathe out love. It could be your your suffering or someone else's. now let's stop this breathing in the suffering and start breathing in only light and love. We're using up the rest of the residue here, so if there's anything that's left over in your heart, then let this be a washing and a cleansing of that by breathing in light and love and breathing out light and love. Now let's come back to the room. I want to say this is one of those, it's kind of surprising, this was one of my first talks. You think, really? Because we've actually been building to this for 3 weeks. I don't know if you know that, but maybe you haven't been here for the last 3 weeks, but that's what we've been doing, is building to this. We're building to the point where we come to the place where we are not an effect of life, but are affecting life. And not because we're afraid of being controlled by life, but because we're actually more open to life and more receptive and more alive and more ready to be the Christed being that we are, to be that presence in the world, to be able to be the one who is in the midst of all the chaos, is the one whose heart stays open. We're building ourselves into a community where we take on responsibility for the world, not by judging it and being righteous over it, but by being the savior of it in this sense, that we will absorb the suffering and we will send out love. And in absorbing, we will not be destroyed, but we will be creating who we really want to be, which is not to be just a person, and we'll still be people. Most likely every one of us will keep an ego here. And we won't get lost in this. But we will be in a state in which we can be both an ego and a Christ at the same time. We can decide to sit and do this. And take our place in the world not as the victim of the world we see, but as a loving being in the world we see. And so this process of pulling in and being that Christ takes courage, causes compassion, but it also liberates, frees us, and the one you're looking at. So you can do this with a loved one. You can sit face to face, lovingly look at each other, and then go into this state of meditation in which you see them for who they really are. Because everyone we see, we tend to see what is on the surface or what they tell us. But we know, because we all are human, we're carrying suffering underneath this. You know, there's been a spate of suicides in the news lately. The average suicide rate has gone up in almost every state in the last 10 years. Lives of quiet desperation are going on all the time. Most likely, we've done it ourselves. We've gotten through. We don't show the world. And thank goodness we don't. I mean, it'd be a little overwhelming if everybody put all their suffering on the table at once. But you can know that no matter who you're looking at, they could use compassion. They could use your love. A lot more than they could use your righteousness, your knowing, your smarts. And so we're trying to build here the conditions for this to be the way we are. By breathing in suffering. Today's lesson is let's breathe in suffering, let's breathe out love. Last week was don't be so smart, you think you know everything, you don't. You don't even know that you know what you don't know. That's just the way we are. But since we don't know it, we're pretty sure we know what we need to know, but we don't know. But now that we've kind of got that out of the way, maybe we can get to this thing, well, okay, since I don't know what I don't know, how about if I become a kind heart? And maybe in our world, What we need right now is more kind hearts than we need smart people. Right? So, want to try again? Let's do this again. Start with your own suffering or take someone else's suffering, depending on which one seems more poignant to you at this moment. Please, and then you're going to start by opening your heart, expanding the heart so you feel the breath in the heart space, you feel the energy grow with each breath. Activate the heart first. Become a heartfelt person. Maybe right now. Maybe you have a loss or a disappointment that's breaking your heart. So if that is so, just let it break open. Or maybe you know someone who's hurting, who could use your compassion. If that's true, either one is true, you know who's suffering to breathe in. Or maybe you just cannot stand what's happening in the world in any particular place. Breathe in that suffering. Don't just breathe it in, breathe out love. Don't get caught in the suffering. Convert it and breathe out love. There is suffering in the world, and this is a way out. Now let us bring this to a close by breathing in only light and breathing out light. Breathe in joy and happiness and complete freedom. Breathe it all in and breathe out the same.
Thank you.